Chicago, 1950. The war had been over for 5 years, but for men like me, the real battle had just begun, one without rifles, without borders, fought in silence on cold streets with empty pockets and a heavier kind of shame. I wandered through the South Side with a squeaky makeshift cart I had assembled from scrap wood and bent wheels, pushing it up alleys and back roads, scavenging broken glass, flattened cans, rusted metal. Anything I could sell to keep me going for another day. There wasn't much pride left in me. Not since the army discharged me. Not since my name stopped meaning anything. Not since I realized that a hero without a war is just a man people cross the street to avoid. Underneath the collar of my soot-streaked coat, tucked behind a threadbare scarf, I still wore my dog tag. It had once been a symbol of identity, of service, of duty. Now it was just a scrap of metal pressed against my chest, like a forgotten scar. The name was still legible, if you looked close enough. Samuel R. Dawson. But no one looked. Not really. Not until that day. I remember it clearly, the way some people remember the moment they first fall in love or hear that someone they care about has died. The morning was grey and wind-chilled, the kind of day where the cold slithered through your bones, no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. I was dragging my cart past an old tenement on 43rd Street when I heard a voice, soft, tentative, but aimed directly at me. "Excuse me, is your name Sam Dawson? Were you in the army in North Africa?" Her voice was gentle, but it struck me like a blast of wind from the desert I thought I had left behind forever. I turned slowly, unsure if she was talking to someone else, unsure if I wanted her to be. Her eyes were locked onto the spot just below my neck, the glint of the tag catching the morning light as it peeked from beneath my scarf. She read the engraving aloud, slowly, as if confirming something with herself. Samuel Dawson. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It had been years since anyone had said my name like that, with recognition. Not contempt, not pity, not suspicion, just recognition, like I was someone worth remembering. I didn't answer her. I didn't have to. My silence spoke for me. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope, creased, stained, soft at the edges, like something that had been carried for a long, long time. She held it out, hand trembling just slightly. "I think this belongs to you." I took the letter with hands I didn't know were shaking. I hadn't seen my name in someone else's handwriting in years. The moment felt like stepping into a room I had locked and sealed shut, one I promised myself I'd never enter again. But as I opened that envelope and the past came rushing back, I realized the war had never really ended. Not for me. It had only been waiting. If this story is already touching you the way it touched me while writing it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that inspire, move, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. Chicago didn't feel like home when I came back from the war. It felt like a city that had moved on without me, like someone who forgot they were supposed to wait. The buildings stood tall, sure, factories back in full swing, trains rumbling across the South Side like iron veins. But something beneath the surface had cracked, and I could feel it every time I stepped onto the broken pavement or heard the laughter of people who had never left. They hadn't seen the desert, hadn't smelled gunpowder in the heat, or watched friends vanish into smoke. I was back, technically, but I was nowhere. And worst of all, I didn't want to be found. I lived in a room that used to be someone's laundry basement, rented from a Polish widow who didn't ask questions so long as I had enough to cover 2 weeks in advance. The walls were crumbling, the pipe in the corner hissed every time I tried to sleep. And when it rained, water traced a thin, steady line down to a rusted bucket I kept beside the bed. But I didn't complain. I didn't deserve more. Every morning, before the frost burned off the sidewalks, I'd grab my cart, assembled from scrap wood and a pair of salvaged baby carriage wheels, and head out into the alleys behind 43rd, 47th, 51st, looking for anything people didn't want anymore. Rusted nails, Flattened bottle caps, wire hangers, torn newspaper, objects left behind by people with better lives. I collected them like memories, useless to others, but somehow proof that I was still here. It was in those alleys that I learned the language of silence. People didn't look at me. I'd pass couples, shopkeepers, dock workers, even kids, and none of them would say a word. Some crossed the street. Others tightened their grip on their belongings. It wasn't fear. They didn't know me well enough to fear me. It was discomfort. I reminded them of something they wanted to forget, a war they didn't fight, a friend who didn't come back, a version of America that didn't include broken men. And I understood that. I really did. Because I didn't want to see myself either. My uniform was long gone. I had pawned it piece by piece the first winter after I got home, not out of spite, but because it made no sense to wear a symbol no one saluted anymore. The medals stayed in a drawer for a while, but eventually I sold those too. A man can't eat ribbon. And the tag, the metal one they gave me on my first day of boot camp, well, that I kept. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the only part of me that still had my name on it. Not just a name, but a story, a past, a place I could point to and say, that was me. I was real once. I never expected anyone else to care, not after all these years. So when the woman, her coat brown and worn, her face lined like a map of time, spoke my name aloud that day, I felt like I'd been struck. Not just heard, but seen. And when she handed me the letter, when she said it came from someone who used to know me, someone who once held that tag in her hands, something cracked open inside me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, before that encounter, I was just another ghost of the war walking through a city too loud to hear whispers like mine. And Chicago, in its own way, seemed built to forget. The headlines were full of jazz clubs, labor strikes, new buildings breaking ground. Nobody wanted to talk about Sicily or Anzio or Tobruk. Nobody asked where I'd been. And if I told them, they'd just nod politely, say, "Thank you for your service," and go back to their ham sandwiches and coffee. So I stopped telling them. It became easier to be nobody, to become a shadow on the streets. I ate at soup kitchens run by nuns who never asked your last name. I slept in warming centers when the pipes in the basement froze. I washed my clothes at night in public restrooms and let them dry on radiator grates. I spoke less and less. And the tag under my shirt became heavier with each passing year. Not because the metal changed, but because the story attached to it grew colder, more distant, like it belonged to someone else. But it didn't. It belonged to Sam Dawson, private first class, serial number 32-1457, infantryman, prisoner of war, son of a steelworker, brother to no one anymore, and once a man in love. When that woman said Anna's name, when she asked if I remembered her, I didn't nod, I didn't cry, I just stared at her because I didn't know if she was real or part of some long-buried dream. And when she reached into her pocket and said she survived, and she had a son, something inside me, something I thought was long dead, began to breathe again. When I opened that letter she handed me, creased, soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, smudged at the corners like it had been read in the rain or held tightly through more than one silent night, I felt like I had stepped backward in time, right into the heart of a war I had tried for years to forget. The words weren't many, and they weren't elegant, but they were unmistakably hers. It was her handwriting, Anna. The moment I saw those curves and loops, that slight slant in the way she always wrote my name, Sam, as if she were whispering it, I wasn't standing on 43rd Street anymore. I wasn't in Chicago. I was back under the merciless sun of North Africa, back among the sandbags and tinned rations, the ceaseless whine of wind through the tent flaps and the distant pop of artillery fire echoing off the horizon. The desert didn't forgive or forget, and neither had I, apparently. She had been a Red Cross nurse, one of the many who came through our station near Tobruk. Most of them moved quickly, focused, doing their jobs without a word more than necessary. But Anna Anna had a quiet way of seeing you, even when you didn't want to be seen. She never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer, never pried. Just smiled softly, dressed wounds gently, and left you with a sense that maybe, somehow, not everything was broken. I was 23. I had already seen too much. A piece of shrapnel had torn through my leg just south of Derna, and I spent 6 weeks in that field hospital, watching as men were brought in and carried out, some moaning, some silent, some so far gone they no longer flinched. But every time Anna passed by, I remembered I was still alive. We didn't have time for romance, we barely had time for sleep. But we exchanged 3 letters during those weeks, scratched in pencil on scraps of whatever we could find, sometimes the back of medical forms, once on the inside of a ration box lid. She kept them tucked in her breast pocket, and I carried hers under my bandage, like a second skin. We wrote about nothing and everything, the weather, our hometowns, what we would do when the war ended. I told her about Chicago, the steel mills, the way the wind off Lake Michigan could cut through you in January. She told me she loved old movies, and that when she was a girl, she wanted to be a writer. Our connection was brief, but it was real. One night, just before I was to be transferred north, we slipped out behind the medical tent, under a sky so clear it felt like the stars could see us, and shared a kiss. No promises, no plans. Just 2 people holding on to each other in the eye of a storm, afraid to let go. Before I boarded the truck the next morning, I gave her my dog tag. I told her, if I don't make it back, at least a part of me will. She nodded but said nothing. Her eyes did the talking. What followed was chaos. I never made it to my next post. The convoy was ambushed and I was captured. For nearly 2 years, I was a prisoner in Germany, surviving on potatoes and whatever courage I had left. No letters came, no news from the outside, just time stretching long and silent like a hallway with no door. When the war ended and I was finally released and sent home, I searched. Quietly, cautiously, I asked around. I wrote to a few names I found on old rosters. Eventually, someone told me Anna had been killed in a bombing raid while stationed in Naples. I remember hearing the words and feeling nothing, not shock, not grief, just that deep, empty silence again, the one that wraps around your bones and tells you not to hope anymore. I buried her then, not with a headstone or ceremony, but in my mind. I stopped talking about her, I stopped remembering. It was easier that way, to forget, to move on, or pretend to. But now, reading that letter, holding that same scrap of paper she must have written by candlelight, or maybe in a trembling moment of fear or longing, I realized that nothing had been buried at all. It had all been waiting. Anna hadn't died in Naples. She had survived. Somehow she had survived the bombing, made it out injured, fled the chaos, and returned to the States under a different name. She had come back, and not alone. She had come back. Pregnant. When the woman who gave me the letter, Anna's younger sister as I would later learn, told me this, I felt like the ground gave out beneath me. My hands went cold, my mouth dry, as if all the blood in my body had rushed away in a single instant of clarity. She had a baby, she said gently. Your baby. At first, I couldn't speak. My mind refused to understand what my heart already knew. She reached into her purse and handed me a photograph, creased at the edges, black and white, worn soft by time. A boy, maybe 5 years old, stood beside a wooden fence in some nameless yard, holding a small wooden cross in his hands. His eyes stared back at me with quiet determination, the same kind I used to see in the mirror when I still believed in things. He's your son, she said. His name is Jacob. I stared at that photograph for what felt like an hour, though I know only a few seconds passed. My hands held it tightly, afraid it might vanish if I blinked or breathed too hard. There he was, Jacob, my son. His face was unfamiliar and yet deeply, painfully familiar. His small, steady hands clutched a crooked wooden cross, the kind a child might make in Sunday school or carve with a pocket knife on a rainy day. But it was his eyes that undid me. Those were mine. not just in color or shape, but in the way they carried something older than his years, as if life had already taught him that nothing stays the same for long. I could barely form words. I think I said his name out loud, but it came out like a prayer. Soft, reverent, disbelieving. Jacob. Anna's sister, her name was Margaret, watched me with the kind of stillness that comes from carrying a secret for too long. She didn't try to explain further. She didn't apologize. She just let me sit with the truth. And the truth was this. While I wandered the streets of Chicago believing everything good in my life had been buried under war and rubble, a boy had been growing up without a father just a few hundred miles away. A boy who thought his dad was a war hero who had died in a far-off place. A boy who didn't know his father was still alive, collecting trash, living in silence, one memory away from collapse. It took me a long time to speak. My mouth felt numb, like I had forgotten how to use it for anything other than begging for work or asking for bread. But finally, I asked her what happened after the war, after Anna came home, after she learned she was pregnant. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, like she was trying to keep them from shaking. She came back in 45. No one knew she had survived. She had injuries, scarring, a limp in her right leg, nerve damage in her hands. She didn't talk much about what happened over there. She said your convoy was hit, that she tried to write to your family but didn't know where you'd gone, and when no one wrote back, she assumed you had died. She paused, and I didn't interrupt. She moved to Detroit, found a job sewing at a small clothing shop. She changed her last name, said it was safer that way, less explaining, less attention. She didn't talk much, Sam, not about the war, not about you. But she kept that dog tag in her pocket every day, every day. My throat burned. And Jacob? I asked, the name now living inside me like something I'd always known. She had him in 45, quiet birth, home delivery, no records, no announcements, just life. He grew up thinking his father died a hero. She didn't want him to believe you left. She wanted him to believe something beautiful about you. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant anymore. I hadn't been beautiful in years. And her, I whispered. She died last winter, pneumonia. It happened fast. She never fully recovered from what happened overseas, and she never had much help. The heating broke that week. She couldn't afford a doctor. Margaret took a breath that seemed to take everything she had. She asked me if anything ever happened to her, to find you. She didn't know where you were, if you were alive, but she believed you were. And she asked me to give you this. She reached into her bag again and handed me a folded napkin. Inside it, worn and faded, was my original dog tag. The very one I had given Anna behind the field tent in North Africa, when I thought I was saying goodbye to everything I loved. She had kept it. Through the chaos, through the pain, through the silence, she had held on. I took it in my hands and felt its cold weight press into my palm. My name was still there, worn, faint, but legible, Samuel R. Dawson. In that moment, I wasn't just a man anymore. I was a father. I was a promise. I was someone who had been expected to come back even if I didn't believe it myself. I sat in silence for a long time, letting the weight of everything settle. I thought about Anna, how she must have suffered, how she must have hoped. I thought about Jacob, a child I never held, whose life had already begun without me. And I thought about myself, the man who had survived war only to live like a ghost. Where is he now? I finally asked. Margaret handed me a slip of paper with an address. He's in a church-run home outside Detroit. They took him in after Anna passed. He doesn't know I found you. He doesn't know anything yet. I looked down at the tag in my hand, then at the photo of the boy. I'm going, I said, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or to God. I don't know what he'll say. I don't even know what I'll say, but I'm going. And in that moment, I wasn't lost anymore. The moment I stepped off that Greyhound bus in Detroit, the cold air hit my face like memory, sharp, immediate, impossible to ignore. And though I had no luggage, no coat heavy enough for march, and no real plan except the address folded and refolded in my hand, I knew I was walking into something I couldn't explain or prepare for, because what lay ahead wasn't just a boy waiting in an orphanage. It was a part of me I had buried, locked away with everything else I had lost in the war, now rising to the surface like a name being called out from a crowd I thought had long since forgotten how to speak mine. The city felt different from Chicago, less rushed, more tired, its streets cracked but less angry, its buildings squat and honest, and its silence not the type that ignored you, but the type that held you gently, like someone who had seen too much and decided kindly not to ask too many questions. I walked the blocks to the church-run home with the steady gait of a man who had nowhere else to be but here, who didn't know what to expect, but who knew with an aching certainty that turning away was no longer an option. Not for me, not for him, and not for the promise I had unknowingly left behind. The orphanage stood on a quiet street, framed by bare sycamore trees. The building itself made of worn red brick and capped with a sagging roof that looked as though it, too, had carried its share of weight through the years. Stood on the steps for several long seconds, hand resting on the rusted railing, watching the frost melt in small rivers along the pavement as the sun finally pushed through the clouds. My breath came in uneven bursts, visible and heavy, and for a brief moment I considered walking away. Not because I lacked the courage to face him, but because I wasn't sure I had the right to claim a place in a story that had already unfolded without me. When the nun opened the door, a tall woman with deep-set eyes and a presence that carried both authority and mercy, I expected questions, maybe suspicion, but instead she simply looked at me, saw the tag in my hand, and said without hesitation, "You're Jacob's father." Not as an accusation, not as an inquiry, but as a truth already accepted by someone who had witnessed enough reunions to know when one was real. I nodded, unable to find words, and followed her through hallways that smelled of oatmeal and linoleum, past children's laughter echoing faintly from behind closed classroom doors, and into a quiet playroom lit by a window streaked with old rain and the soft gold of the afternoon light. There, on a worn rug scattered with wooden blocks, sat Jacob, my son, cross-legged, hunched over a careful construction of arches and walls, his fingers moving slowly, precisely, the way a boy does when he's trying to build something that won't fall. He didn't look up when I entered. His whole body was wrapped in the quiet focus of creation, and I stood there for a moment, uncertain whether to speak or simply watch, as if my presence might disturb the delicate world he had formed around himself. Finally, I lowered myself to the floor beside him, the dog tag still in my hand, its metal cool and weighty. For several minutes we said nothing, only the sounds of wood clicking gently against wood filling the silence. Then, without turning, he asked, "Are you here for someone?" I swallowed, feeling every word I might say gathering like a storm in my chest. "Yes," I replied, voice low but steady. "I came looking for someone I should have found a long time ago." He glanced at me then quickly, like a bird checking for danger, and his eyes, those eyes, landed on the tag in my hand. "That's yours?" he asked. "It was," I said, offering it to him. "I gave it to your mom a long time ago. She kept it safe. Now I want you to have it." He took it carefully, almost reverently, and turned it over in his small palm, reading the worn letters as if deciphering a secret. "She told me about you," he said, barely above a whisper. "Said you were a hero. Said you didn't want to go, but you had to." I nodded, unable to answer. "She used to sing," he continued. "I don't remember the words, just the sound. It made me feel safe." And with that, the blocks around him collapsed, not in reality, but in my mind. Because the child I had come to meet wasn't waiting for a hero, wasn't hoping for explanations or war stories. He just wanted to feel safe again. And I, broken, worn, late, I wanted nothing more than to give him that. Over the following days, I kept returning. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't press him with questions or demand closeness. I just showed up, brought puzzles, helped him draw, sat beside him while he built bridges and towers. Slowly, he let me into the quiet spaces of his world, and I filled them not with apologies, but with presence. The sisters watched, quietly supportive. Margaret visited once, standing at a distance, her eyes soft with recognition and something close to relief. Then, one cold morning, just as I was about to leave, Jacob ran after me, his breath fogging in the air, one hand clutching the tag I'd given him, and called out, not loudly, not theatrically, but with the certainty of a boy who had decided something for himself. "Hey, Dad!" The word hit me harder than any explosion I'd survived overseas. I turned, blinking back tears that no longer needed to hide. "Yeah," I answered, heart full. He smiled, shrugged shyly. "Can you stay a little longer tomorrow?" And I knew in that moment I would never leave again. Today, when I walk through the doors of the small bike repair shop I now run on the east side of Detroit, I no longer feel like a man passing through borrowed time. I feel like someone who was given a second chance, not through luck or mercy, but through the enduring strength of love that waited quietly for me to return, even when I didn't know there was anyone still waiting at all. The shop is modest, just a single garage bay and a battered wooden sign out front, but every bolt I tighten, every chain I fix, feels like a quiet act of restoration, not just for the machines, but for myself, as if each bicycle brought back to life somehow mends a piece of the man who once believed he had nothing left worth fixing. Jacob, he's 13 now, comes by most afternoons after school, dropping his backpack on the floor with a thud, asking if I need help, though usually he just sits in the back room with his sketch pad or his guitar, scribbling chords or drawing imaginary cities with wide streets and no fences, places where no one is lost and every road leads home. He still keeps the dog tag in his coat pocket, says it's lucky, though I know he carries it for more than that. He carries it because it reminds him who he came from, and maybe, in some way, who he might become. Above my workbench, in a frame, simple and slightly crooked, hangs the only photograph I have of Anna, taken sometime before the war, I think. Her smile soft, her hair pulled back, her eyes steady in a way that still unsettles me with their clarity. Below the photo, centered with care, is the very same dog tag I gave her in the heat of a desert night when I thought I wouldn't live to see another sunrise. She kept it with her for years, through fear, through loneliness, through childbirth, and even through death, and now it rests where I can see it every day, not as a relic of battle, but as a promise kept. I whisper to her sometimes when the shop is quiet and the wind pushes against the glass just right. I tell her we're doing okay, that Jacob laughs more now, that he has my stubbornness and her grace, that the world she left behind is still broken, but we're finding our way, one gear at a time. And I've come to understand that returning from war is not the same as surviving it, because you can survive in pieces, survive as a shadow, survive in silence, but to return, to truly return, you must let yourself be seen again, let yourself be loved again, and hardest of all, let yourself hope. I am not the man I once was. I am not the soldier. I am not the ghost. I'm something else now. Someone who remembers, who rebuilds, who wakes up each morning not asking what he's lost, but who he still has to fight for. And that makes all the difference. If anyone were to ask me today who I am, I wouldn't show them my tag or list my rank or tell them what I did in North Africa. I'd point to the picture on the wall, I'd call out to the boy in the back room, and I'd say, I'm Sam Dawson. I came back, not for glory, but for them. And if they asked if it was worth it, everything I went through, everything I lost, I'd tell them this. Sometimes the war takes everything, but if you're lucky, if you listen closely enough to the echoes of the ones who loved you most, it might leave you one last chance to find your way home. We share new stories every day, real voices that touch, inspire, and stay with you. If this story spoke to you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps keep these memories alive.